This time on Poll Hub, the fourth and final in a series of special episodes on 1968, the year that rocked American politics. It's the 50th anniversary of that incredibly consequential year, and our focus this time is on the politics of 1968. In hindsight, many historians see it as the end of the New Deal Democratic era and the start of the Southern Republican era. But in the moment, at the time, it was a nearly non-stop series of mind-boggling events, including the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. Events that not only underscored a growing sense among American voters that the country was coming apart, but a real sense that there was no great future for America. We talk with author, journalist, and aide to Robert Kennedy, Jeff Greenfield, about the year and all that has come since.
Took me 4 days to hitchhike from Saginaw. I've come to look for America.
Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll. This spring on the Marist College campus here in Poughkeepsie, New York, we've been holding a series of discussions with notable thinkers about 1968, the war, civil rights, the political upheaval. We've talked about it all and also how it relates to our current political climate. Our fourth and final guest was Jeff Greenfield, who you likely know from his work at ABC News, CBS News, and CNN over several decades. You might not know that he's also the author of 10 books. And he was an aide and speechwriter to Robert Kennedy in 1968. Our discussion took place in the Hancock Center here at Marist in front of an audience that included students, alumni, faculty, and staff. The regular Poll Hub crew, Lee Miringoff, Barbara Carvalho, and I led the discussion. And here's a portion of that conversation.
So we've asked every speaker to kind of start us out in 1968 and give a sense of where they were and what they were doing. But I'd like to, because of the unique circumstances that you experienced in 1968, I'm going to ask the second question about 1968, the year, but I'd first like to get a sense of what your perceptions were 1 week before California and the assassination, and then what your perceptions were after, the week after. But then I want to talk about where you were in January and.
So you sort of want to start sort of near the end.
You can go either way.
No, that's okay. The week before California, Robert Kennedy had lost the Oregon primary to Gene McCarthy. It was the first election any Kennedy had lost, and he was very candid about this. He said, "This is a setback. There was no spin, not a moral victory, not a close second. This was a setback," he said. And California now becomes critical. And he said flatly, if I don't win California, I'm withdrawing from the race. And in the days leading up to California, there was an effort on our part, the Kennedy campaign, to try to reach out to the McCarthy people to make the same commitment, to say, look, the establishment of the Democratic Party is behind Vice President Humphrey. This is an era when there were very few primaries, not like today. Most of the delegates are under the control of party leaders in big states. They are strongly inclined to go with Humphrey. And the only way we have a prayer of winning this nomination, if there's one peace candidate, a divided peace candidacy is. So a couple of nights before the California primary, a journalist, opinion writer named Jack Newfield, a strong Kennedy supporter, and I went to the McCarthy Hotel headquarters to try to talk to our contemporaries, and the bitterness about Robert Kennedy's late entry into the race was still there. One of them said, I'd rather see Nixon than Bobby. We also learned that some of the key McCarthy people, on the other hand, were leaning very strongly in the direction of saying, look, if Bobby wins the California, we're coming over. Because then, so that was where we were the week before. California back then was a winner-take-all state. That is, if you won the primary by one vote, you won all 175 delegates. It also turned out, we did not know this, that Richard Daley, the mayor of Chicago, the Democratic boss of Illinois, with all those delegates in his pocket, had quietly said to a Bobby Kennedy supporter in Illinois, if Bobby wins California, he'll be all right. And that would have been an enormous boost, because it was a signal to the rest of the Democratic Party establishment, hey, here's Mr. Machine politician saying, we got to go with Bobby because he'll beat Nixon and Humphrey won't. that's where we were in the week leading up. It was clear it was going to be a tight race. The Humphrey people were throwing everything they could to McCarthy to try to defeat Bobby, even though there was an uncommitted slate. And so there was a debate, I think the weekend before the primary, between McCarthy and Kennedy. There was a furious bit of motion. I mean, the whole campaign felt like it was on 3 times speed. It was like fast forward on your remote. Up the coast, up into San Francisco, into the barrios, into the ghettos, into the working class neighborhoods, knowing McCarthy was stronger in the middle class suburbs. Because traditionally, it's much harder in a primary to get out an African American and Hispanic vote for all kinds of reasons, and this was going to have to be an unprecedented turnout. That's where we were, and as it turned out, there's a story I just ran into that in one African American district, they were closing the polls early, and there was a great deal. What is this? Is this voter suppression? It turned out that every registered voter in that district had voted.
Wow.
And indeed, the turnout thanks to Cesar Chavez, the United Farm Worker president, worked very hard, and the turnout among Hispanics was unprecedented. And we didn't win by as much as we wanted. We wanted a 50% win. We got, I think, 46%. But the night ended with the sense of this was going to be tough, but there was a chance.
Of the nomination also. Yeah. And so tell me,
and then,
later that night, obviously the assassination, and what's the next
the
week
first
like
irony
for you?
I have to mention was that there was always a concern about the crowds. Not that there was that the sheer enthusiasm at times was almost a physical danger, because they would rush to the motorcade. And then there was also this thing that in the back of everybody's mind, it was when John Kennedy was assassinated, it was a total shock. Nothing like this had happened in decades. But in 1968, the crime rate in the United States had doubled and doubled again. There was violence in dozens of American cities. There was violence on campus. Martin Luther King had been killed 8 weeks earlier. And there was always a lurking feeling of, what's out there. The irony is that in an effort to avoid a crowd that night, after the victory speech, there was supposed to be another rally in the hotel, and Bobby Kennedy was totally exhausted. So to spare him that, they took him away from the crowds through that kitchen. And he only had one security guard. The Secret Service was not protecting candidates back then. And Roosevelt Greer, the retired football player, and this ex-FBI agent, because of this last-minute decision, were trying to catch up to him when Sirhan shot him. And I hope this doesn't sound cynical, but while the assassination was devastating, I can't say it was shocking in the way it was 5 years earlier, because we had so much violence in so many different ways that it was almost like, that's where we are.
Yeah. Were you at the Ambassador?
Yeah. That picture of me lying that's in the
watching
presidential suite, watching the election returns, and getting ready to go to a victory party.
Okay.
Yeah.
So tell me about
the other thing I should mention is there was a very brief clip of the funeral train.
Yeah.
That was the most powerful 8 hours you could imagine. It was supposed to be a 4-hour trip, but the crowds were so big, and a couple of people were killed by that train because they fell off a platform, and the train slowed down. So for 8 hours, we went from New York to Washington. Inside the train, there was a spirit of an Irish wake. And so there was a lot of storytelling, and there was a lot of laughter, because that's
what you do.
Some people grieve and rend their garments, and the Irish tell stories, and they remember good times. But every time, I can only speak for myself, but I know it wasn't just me. Every time you looked out the window and saw the people lined along the railroad tracks to say goodbye, and there were veterans wearing their now ill-fitting uniforms. There were Little League teams that were lining up and saluting. There were people of every conceivable kind of background holding signs saying goodbye. And part of it was that you were seeing what would have been his constituency had he lived. And in looking out the window, that's when I would lose it. that's when I just, absolutely dissolved. Because, that was the promise that we were never going to see whether it was going to be fulfilled.
Yeah.
I'd like to stay with your recollections of the year a little bit more, and maybe turn to the beginning of the year,
Right.
and then kind of contrast that with how you felt in November.
Well,
I mean, because you are just a little bit older then, or actually the same age of many of the students who
a
are.
little bit older.
I was
are here.
24 when I was in this campaign, because I was right out of law school. I can tell you that I've already heard a couple of the smarter conceivable questions about just this point, which is, did you sort of know at the time that this was a time of, did you look up and go, oh my God, it's the 60s? But in a funny way, the answer is yes. Maybe not that self-consciously, but the shift in the country from like 1963 and 64, where change was gradual. I mean, if you looked at the way college students dressed in 1964, they were pretty much the way you would dress in 1960. You go back to that same campus 4 years later, and you're on a different planet.
Culturally.
Every way. Well, for instance, it may not be easy to remember this, but as late as 1961 or 2, at the University of Wisconsin, women had to be in their dorms at 10:30 at night, 12:30 on weekends. And they were punished if they weren't. They were made to stay home the next Saturday night and study.
Now they have to leave by 10:30 to go out. It's totally different.
And look,
It just has a different
As
sense.
opposed to the male students?
male students had no
No
limits.
curfew.
No.
Okay.
It was a different time.
Quite.
I will say with some humor that because 10:30 was the time you had to be in, the couples would often linger at the door of the dorm and say goodnight in extremely passionate ways. The scene in front of a girl's dorm at 10:30 at night was in the early 60s. But by 1968, you've got the dress is somewhat different or optional. The protests, which were very mannered and orderly in the early 60s, if there were protests, people would wear like coats and ties. By later 1960s, there's tear gas on my old campus. There are National Guardsmen. There is real, serious disruption. The birth control pill becomes readily available in 1964. That's a fairly significant change. The music, 1964 was the Beatles' first movie when the more intellectual people said, perhaps rock music has something to it. By 1967 and 8, it's become the Jefferson Airplane, and it's become the Dead, and it's become Jimi Hendrix. So this radical shift. And then you add to that the political sense that things are really in a very disruptive state. When I was working in the Senate, I was friends with a lot of the younger kind of junior speechwriters, and it turns out every single one of us, if you're a speechwriter, you need books of quotations so that the guy you're writing for, or the lady you're writing for, can sound smart. And everybody had the same quotation right here. It's from William Butler Yeats, from The Second Coming. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is everywhere, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. And it wasn't kind of melodramatic to think that's what it kind of felt like. That you would turn on the TV, and you were seeing carnage in Vietnam, and you were seeing carnage in the streets of big cities, and you were sometimes seeing, if not carnage, some pretty rough stuff happening in the middle of college campuses. So that's what I remember, even thinking at the time of this is a strange and disruptive and disorderly time, completely out of whack from what might have expected just a few years earlier.
How did you become a Kennedy supporter when many of your peers were actually McCarthy?
No. I started working for Bobby Kennedy in July of 1967. So
that was it for
and
you.
in those days,
Did you feel a disconnect, or did you feel any kind of awkwardness, or have to debate your peers?
Well,
on
it was
the issue?
awkward because, in fact, for months there'd been this tension between some of Robert Kennedy's supporters. I mean, the whole Senate staff wanted him to run because For one thing, every Senate staffer wants their boss to be president.
Yeah.
But beyond that, it really did seem like, we were in a state that we just could not have 4 more years of this guy as president, because apart from everything else, there seemed to be a sense that Johnson was losing control. The war was going badly. As I said, the domestic upheaval. So part of him wanted to run for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is he and Lyndon Johnson, as one book described it, had mutual contempt. They genuinely, badly dislike each other. And I think one of the things that Robert Kennedy had in the back of his mind was, I tried really hard to get him off the ticket in 1960. I did not want him running with my brother, which, by the way, might have cost John Kennedy the election in terms of Johnson's strength in the South. But that Bobby felt in some ways personally responsible that he, or certainly his brother, had put this guy in power. But you have to understand also, it's not just Bobby's older senior advisors telling him, you can't do this. No sitting president has been denied his party's nomination since Chester Arthur. You can't win. Your time is 1972. And you're going to split the party, which is going to open the door to Richard Nixon. And it's not unimportant to note that even the anti-war Democratic senators, like George McGovern, said to him, don't do this. I'm up for re-election this fall. It'll kill us. What happened was by March, early March, when the Tet Offensive had indicated that we were in for a long haul, he had apparently decided to change his mind. And as a junior staffer, you have to understand, Robert Kennedy was not calling in a 24-year-old kid and saying, what do you think I should do? What's your sense of the political terrain? It wasn't quite like that. But it was clear something was going on. And what was going on was that he was sending people to look for delegate support in some states. But he didn't say anything until after McCarthy won. And the day after McCarthy won, he said, I'm reassessing. And that was clumsy, and it hurt his campaign badly. He lost some supporters. He always felt bad that during the campaign a couple of times, he actually had dinner with a couple of McCarthy kids, and just to talk to them. And he felt very, he kind of felt wistful. He said, that they should have been with me, but he knew full well they weren't.
One of the things that struck me in digging back into this, and I was 6 years old in 1968, so I don't remember it very well, but I covered a couple of elections, including 2000 that went on forever as a journalist. But 2016, 2017, 2018, we live right now in a period where between the tweets and everything else, it seems like everything is on super speed. But I want to go back to between the New Hampshire primary and MLK being assassinated.
Yeah.
That's 3 weeks, maybe
Right.
3.5 weeks. So much happened that changed everything about this country in some ways. Can you?
Yeah, because it's an important point you're making.
What was it like to be in those 3 weeks? And again, maybe you didn't recognize it at the time, maybe you did. But
no, but this is
those 3 weeks
something
are huge.
that I don't even know how to communicate this to people half a century younger. And that is that the pace of news, even in this time you're talking about, was infinitely slower. No, I mean, this may come as a shock to you. We didn't have smartphones. We didn't have cable. We didn't have, God knows, social media of any kind. So what I mean by that is, even in this hothouse atmosphere, so the evening news goes away. And in those days, in this part of the country, the news came out at 7 o'clock. Walter Cronkite. 7:30, he goes off the air. The next piece of news you are going to get is when the morning newspaper, I hope you recognize what I'm talking about, this randomly accessible dead tree thing,
I've showed them a few in class.
hits your doorstep
I
the
brought in a
next
few exhibits.
morning.
The next morning.
So that's part of what's going on, is that you're not enveloped with this endless, permanent, addictive flow. But even so you get the following. You get you get the New Hampshire primary. 5 days later, Robert Kennedy announces for president. 16th. 15 days later, Lyndon Johnson says, I'm not running for re-election. And 4 days after that, Martin Luther King is killed. And oh, by the way, somewhere in this mix, there is a violent uprising at Columbia University, which ends after a couple of weeks in police going in and knocking a lot of heads together. So I think the best way to say it is, Two things. One, when you're in the middle of this, it's a little bit, I guess, like being in the eye of a hurricane, which is supposed to be kind of calm. You don't really think of going. You don't go, oh my God, what now? You just mostly because you're working 18-hour days on a campaign trail, and you're trying to remember what city you're in when you wake up. Quite literally. I woke up one morning, and I think at the time we actually shared room with a guy. With a senior speaker, I said, "Are we in Montana, or are we in Idaho?" I turned on the TV, and it took a while to find out. So that's what I mean. The country. I don't know what that period would have been like with social media. I can't even imagine the circuits blowing.
Yeah. Wow. One of the things when you're going to meet with the students in the class later, one of the things that we've been talking about in the semester was the relationship of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, which was such a unique relationship during the whole period, starting when he was Attorney General, and then
there's a book that's just come out that David Margolick is doing.
The Promise and the Dream.
Because it was a very complicated relationship.
Yeah.
I will take a minute or two, and if I'm going long, please.
No,
please. So the Kennedy administration comes into power, and they're not particularly big on civil rights. John Kennedy was not a major figure. And at the time, the Republican Party was actively competing for black votes. A lot of Republicans were more committed to civil rights, and the big opposition to civil rights came from Southern segregationist Democrats, who happened to run every key committee in Congress. So in order for John Kennedy to get any of his program through, he had to placate these folks. And so he went he temporized on civil rights. He appointed a couple of outright racist judges as the price of getting some black judges on the court and getting cooperation. Robert Kennedy at the Department of Justice, when the Freedom Rides began, was of two minds. He wanted these freedom riders protected from the violent white potential killers, but he also thought that they were disruptive, that this wasn't the way that we were going to get to where we got to go. They were committed to the idea, which turned out actually to be right, that the key to ending this state-sanctioned segregation was to get the votes in the hands of African Americans. And it turned out historically to be true. So he also saw King as a bit of a troublemaker. And there was this other dimension that J. Edgar Hoover, who was an unrepentant, if private, racist, saw King as a communist and as a moral degenerate because, in fact, King had extracurricular friends. And so he got Robert Kennedy to sign off on bugging Martin Luther King's phone. The March on Washington originally bothered the Kennedy brothers. They were afraid of a violent uprising. But when the march went off successfully, I was on that march, which was one of the more memorable things of my life. The Kennedys went all in on a civil rights bill. And that really potentially was a political liability because the South just said, the hell with you. And Kennedy had carried a number of southern states, as Democrats did. And so just before Jack Kennedy went to Dallas, and they had a political meeting, they realized that, this was going to be a potential problem. Not just in the South, there was a lot of white backlash going on. So anyway, over time, particularly as Robert Kennedy began to move much more in the direction of trying to become literally a voice of black America, he and King became more allied. And just in preparing for this, it turns out that King was seriously considering breaking with tradition and endorsing Robert Kennedy for president, which would have been a big deal because they tried to stay out.
Yeah, and he hadn't done any of that.
Yeah.
Partisan.
I mean, somebody just sent me a new book, a revised edition of some of Kennedy's speeches, and the startling thing, I thought I knew this, is when you read what Robert Kennedy is saying about black America, he's saying, okay, whites see the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Act and the progress, and they think, well, why are people complaining? And then he would say, but if you are living in a ghetto, if there are no jobs, if your schools are warehouses, if your housing is rat-infested, if you see on your television screens affluence all over the country and you are shut out, how do you feel? And that very much resonated with the whole Martin Luther King message that there is a promise in America's founding, but that has not yet been fulfilled.
Yeah. And they both are sort of in '67 are reevaluating the position of the war. There was, just to stay on the Martin Luther King example for 1 second, the famous Robert Kennedy clip in Indianapolis, which many of you are familiar with, the impromptu comments that he made Indianapolis upon hearing the word that Martin Luther King had been assassinated. The next day, he had a speech scheduled in Cleveland, I think.
That's right.
Downtown Business Council.
It's a city club or something like that.
And in many ways, I felt, and I'm curious your reaction, because I know you were involved with that.
Yeah.
I mean, that speech is called The Mindless Menace of Violence, and in many ways was his own epitaph.
It was. And there's
could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there's a great, awful irony about that speech.
Yeah. Did you help write that?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
You know, Kennedy came back from this remarkable ad lib extemporaneous talk in the black neighborhood of Indianapolis. It's not coincidental that that was one of the few cities that did not go up in violence the next few days, and said, you know, I want to say something tomorrow. I tell the story often that both my senior partner, Adam Walensky, and I kind of, by I don't know what hour, 2 o'clock in the morning, and Kennedy came into our room, and he actually pulled the covers and sort of tucked me in. And I said to him, well, I guess you're not so ruthless. He said, don't tell anybody. But the speech was an attempt to say, not just about the mindlessness of violence, but thanks to Adam Walensky, he's also talking about the violence of institutions, of schools that don't teach, of houses that that are awful, that big institutions that are indifferent to all the people who need help, which was a really important coda, not just violence that lights up the television screen. The awful irony is that actually William F. Buckley noted before Robert Kennedy's death, I think, is actually, horrible as it is to say, violence has often accomplished a great deal in an awful way. You know, you shoot the Archduke of Ferdinand and World War I breaks out. You shoot Yitzhak Rabin and the hopes for a Middle East peace take a dive. You shoot John Kennedy and maybe, I've argued this in an alternate history, maybe you take out the guy who might have turned away from escalation in Vietnam. And you shoot Robert Kennedy and the hopes of several million people are dashed. So the real epitaph, awful as it is to say, is that mindless violence is one thing, but there's also mindful violence. You know, people who know full well what they're doing. Not that he was indifferent to that. I mean, when you write a speech, you can't say everything, and you have to strike certain notes. But that was what occurred to me after everything.
That was just a portion of the conversation with Jeff Greenfield. You can watch video of the entire session on the Marist Poll Facebook page. And in the coming months, we'll be putting together some special editions of Poll Hub featuring some of the best bits from all 4 discussions that didn't make it into the initial episodes. A huge thanks to Nicolette Strano and the rest of the Marist Poll team for making this session possible. And as always, Poll Hub only happens with the hard work of our great executive producer, Mary Griffith. Remember, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Marist Poll. And if you like what you hear, please remember to tap the subscribe button wherever it is that you get your podcasts. That's it for now. We'll see you next time.